bad news for this world.
The war in Ukraine can seem like chaos.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country is going to support the pause as well, but later Zelensky said Russia had launched a barrage of drones toward Ukraine.
Russia is claiming Ukraine targeted a key air base in a massive drone attack overnight.
Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of launching air attacks that destroyed civilian infrastructure early on Wednesday.
The prospect of a 30-day ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia was a glimmer of hope in the shadow of war. But just an hour after meeting with Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin destroyed this hope. As Russian missiles and drones rained down on Ukraine, Kiev had already seen that this scenario was inevitable. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sought a full peace, saying that to discuss a partial ceasefire is to step back. But Vladimir Putin had other intentions. Moscow's betrayal sparked an explosion of anger in Kiev. Ukraine immediately responded to the Russian aggression. Critical military installations in Engels and Krasnodar were targeted, but the biggest blow landed in Crimea. Ukrainian drones disabled Russian air defense systems in Crimea, blinding radars. The biggest shock of the attack took place in the waters of the Black Sea. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, which had already suffered heavy losses, bled even more with the destruction of another warship. Could this latest attack turn Vladimir Putin's fears of losing Crimea into reality? How can Russia respond to this retaliatory attack? For answers to these questions and more, our video begins. Let us analyze the details of Ukraine's attacks on the Crimean Peninsula. Ukrainian Defense Intelligence kamikaze drones carried out a large-scale attack. About 24 Russian military installations in Crimea were targeted. The kamikaze drones used in the attack were equipped with an optical camera for more precise targeting and destruction of moving targets. Thanks to the drones' advanced equipment, Russia's air and naval assets were severely damaged. The most notable element of the attack was the tugboat Fedor Uryupin. The tug was built in 2010. The tug was operated by Ukraine's state oil and gas company, Chornomornaftogaz, which came under Russian control after the annexation of Crimea. The attack on the vessel was first reported in December 2024, and it was stated that the drone hit the Uryupin above the waterline, causing damage but not sinking it. The newly released video shows typical footage often seen in FPV drone attacks. The footage clearly shows the drone approaching the target at high speed and the signal being interrupted just before the collision. This footage confirms the successful attack by Ukrainian drones on the Russian Navy. A Russian tugboat was completely destroyed in the attack, while a transport and towing vessel of the C-4236 project was reportedly seriously damaged. The attack on the two Russian ships was carried out by naval drones Sea Baby or Magura 5 USVs, as the video released by Ukrainian intelligence clearly shows. The main intelligence directorate of Ukraine showed an excellent video compilation on the weakening of Russia's air defenses in Crimea. The video lasts 3 minutes, during which a significant number of radar systems are destroyed in a short period of time using attack drones. Defense intelligence reported that among the damaged equipment, radar and air defense systems were also destroyed, including 3 Pantsir S-1 missile systems and a Mi-8 helicopter. Thus, the destruction of 248 YA-6K, 1 Podlet air defense radar systems, 21L 125 Niobium SV radar systems, and 339 N6 Kasta 2E2 radar systems were recorded. The fire control system of the 9S-19 Imbir radar and the Niebo M, 59 N6E Protivnik GE and MISE radars were also damaged. In addition to the radars, the launcher of the S-300 SV system, the command centers of the ST-68 radar, and the 39 N6 Kasta 2E2 radar were also hit. In total, 12 radar stations of various types were counted as destroyed. These stations were designed to control airspace at various altitudes, in particular to counter Ukrainian drones and cruise missiles. The total value of the destroyed equipment is estimated at over 500 million United States dollars. The point here is not the monetary value, but rather that these objects would be extremely difficult for the Russians to restore. So why were radars targeted more in the attacks? Without radar, any air defense system would be blinded and unable to function effectively against enemy attacks. Therefore, when it is necessary to remove an air defense division from combat readiness, the attack is primarily directed not at the launchers, but at the radar station. That is why we see a large number of radars and a smaller number of anti-aircraft missile systems in the list of destroyed targets. So how painful is this loss for the Russian forces, and what can it lead to? First of all, you need to understand this. The production of radar stations in the Russian Federation is radically different in speed and volume from the production of air defense systems, which the Russians do not get much of. The fact is that even before the sanctions were imposed on Russia, the radar production process required much more man-hours. It also required much more resources, even more so in the current situation. Air defense systems in Russia are the slowest of all the products produced by the military-industrial complex. And radar is probably the peak in terms of production complexity and supply shortages. Therefore, in the event of the loss of a radar station, the Russian command does not expect it to be replaced from production. It dismantles a working system from another division somewhere in the Russian rear and transfers it to the division that has lost its combat capability. In the list of deactivated radar stations in Crimea, even an ordinary citizen can see a large number of different names, and this is not surprising. For example, the Nyebo M and Kasta 2E2 radars speak volumes. The fact is that the standard equipment of the Air Defense Division, consisting of the S-300 or S-400 anti-aircraft missile system, includes the 92N2E sectoral control radar and the 91N6E circular surveillance radar. However, after the start of regular flights to Crimea, the number of these stations has decreased. In fact, there are barely enough 91 N6Es per regiment, not even enough to support a division. To compensate for the lack of all-round radar, simpler, accessible radar stations, Nyebo M and Kasta 2E2 were imported to Crimea, and their destruction is indicative of Russia's difficult situation in providing regular radar for its air defense divisions. The failure of the Podlyat combat radar station also points to problems in the regular supply of systems to the Crimean group. These systems were deployed at the same time as the Nyebo and Kasta duty stations in order to mutually reinforce each other. But this did not work either. The destruction or even damage of all these radars leads to the neutralization of the Russian air defense in Crimea. This defense currently consists of the 12th and 18th Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiments and the 3rd Radio Engineering Regiment. And given all this, the organized hunt by drones of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to catch the eyes of the Russians was a great success. So what can happen when the Russian air defense in Crimea is blinded? Russian air defenses have long stretched between the zones of active combat operations and the rear zone, where radars and air defense systems have been withdrawn to compensate for losses. And the sound of these ties breaking is heard almost every night in some parts of Russia. We predict that this weakening of Russia's air defenses will create the opportunity for a new wave of Ukrainian attacks on occupied Crimea, targeting more Russian military assets and further reducing Russia's capabilities in that region. So what weapons were used in the attack that shook Russia so badly? Gur's video does not show drone bots, but given how far Crimea is from the front lines, this is the most likely method for such an attack. Another possibility, though less likely, is that some of the FPV drones were launched close to their targets by partisans opposing the Russian occupation of Crimea. If launched from a drone boat, this would be the biggest example of them deploying FPV drones for attacks. The merging of the two drone systems was first revealed in January, when FPV drones were launched from drone boats, also known as unmanned surface vessels. They were used against two Russian Pantsir-S-1 systems and an OSA system in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine's southern Kherson region. Launching FPV drones from USVs greatly extends the range of these fast, highly maneuverable weapons, enabling them to hit targets that require more expensive long-range strike weapons, which are usually far fewer in number. However, as Ukraine demonstrates its campaign against Russia's oil infrastructure, it also has a large number of long-range drones at its disposal. Another advantage of using FPV drones for these attacks is that it is more difficult to defend against them using conventional air defense systems such as those being targeted. Unlike the front lines, where FPV drones are a ubiquitous threat, Russia will not have the same level of countermeasure systems deployed in Crimea to fend off FPV drones. The merging of these two systems is the latest development in Ukraine's Black Sea drone warfare, which has seen increasingly innovative use of uncrewed systems, including adapted air-to-air missiles launched from USVs against Russian aircraft. Besides being another example of Ukrainian technical innovation, this wave of attacks continues to target Russian air defense and radar systems in Crimea. Disabling these systems potentially pokes holes in Russia's air defense layer of the peninsula and the northwestern Black Sea. This could go a long way in ensuring the survival of remote attack weapons such as Storm Shadow and Scalp EG and other attacks such as long-range kamikaze drones. Ukraine is also continuing its asymmetric struggle against Russia's Black Sea fleet, attacking 2 ships and a helicopter. Ukrainian USVs inflicted disproportionate losses on Russian surface ships operating in that body of water. Russia used Mi-8 HIP helicopters to defend against Ukrainian USVs. Given the large number of attacks in a short time frame, it is possible that Ukraine could soften up Russia's air and missile defense capabilities for a much larger air attack. While Ukraine's leaders have made it clear that they want the return of Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014, the ongoing peace talks may make this goal unattainable. In this context, every attack on the peninsula is a heavy blow to Vladimir Putin's image. They also weaken Russia's grip on Crimea. Putin panicked and forced the Russian Navy and Air Force to leave the peninsula. Russians in Crimea are fleeing the peninsula. It is estimated that the number of people who have fled Crimea so far has reached 100,000. Russian officials and military personnel in Crimea have begun to quickly move their families back to Russia out of fear of a possible Ukrainian attack. Atesh partisans emphasize that this panic has prompted Russians living in Crimea to sell their property and real estate and prepare to flee. In particular, families of soldiers and pro-Russian officials are being listed for evacuation, sparking a social outrage in Crimea. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine also published a report confirming this situation. The report states that evictions of certain categories of citizens have intensified in Crimea recently. In particular, military personnel of the Russian forces stationed in Perevalne have started sending their families to Russia. According to the Crimean National Resistance Group, the Russians have compiled a list of employees and their families who are subject to priority evacuation. In some cities, these evacuation plans have already been prepared and approved. In the town of Krasnoperekopsk, in the north of Crimea, close to the Ukrainian mainland, evacuation plans are also reportedly being prepared. This development shows that Russians living on the peninsula and the occupation forces are becoming increasingly nervous about a possible Ukrainian attack. In Simferopol, the center of Crimea, evacuation preparations are also in full swing. Civil servants in Simferopol are receiving detailed briefings on how to act in case of evacuation. Civil servants working in state-owned enterprises have reportedly been instructed to fill out questionnaires with the full names of evacuees and details of their family members in case of a possible evacuation. These questionnaires show how thoroughly and organized the evacuation process is being planned. These evacuation preparations in Crimea are not limited to the land route. Russian military officers and their relatives are planned to be evacuated by air, land, and sea. Existing evacuation routes have already been identified, and the aim is to ensure safe exits via these routes. On the other hand, the panic in Crimea is not limited to evacuation preparations. The real estate market in the peninsula is also experiencing a serious recession. Urban construction companies operating in the Russian-occupied territories have decided to temporarily suspend their operations in Crimea as they face a supply that exceeds demand in the real estate market. This indicates that economic activity in Crimea has slowed down significantly, and investors have started to withdraw from the region. The territory annexed by Russia in 2014, with Turkey to the south, Bulgaria and Romania to the west, Georgia to the east, and Ukraine and Russia to the north, may now fly blue and yellow flags. But Ukraine's hard-won achievements could be undone through diplomacy. The Trump administration is considering recognizing Ukraine's Crimea region as Russian territory as part of any future deal to end Moscow's war against Kiev, two sources close to the matter said. Administration officials have also discussed the possibility of the United States urging the United Nations to do the same. Such a request would bring the Trump administration in line with the position of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has long recognized Crimea as his country's territory. The administration's openness to these previously unreported options comes as Trump prepares for his meeting with Putin and with a potential 30-day ceasefire agreement on the table. Trump said negotiators have already discussed the division of certain assets. Trump has yet to make a formal decision, and the Crimea moves are just two of numerous options being floated as part of his administration's push to end the war. The White House declined to comment. After this story was published, National Security Council spokesman Brian Hughes said the administration had made no such commitment and would not negotiate this deal through the media. If the United States officially recognizes Crimea, which Russia invaded and illegally annexed from Ukraine in 2014 as Russian territory, it will provoke a strong reaction in Europe, as well as in Kiev, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is firmly opposed to territorial concessions. The United States, Ukraine, and much of the international community have recognized Crimea as Ukraine despite Russia's occupation of the peninsula. Crimea is still a double-edged sword. Ukraine has repeatedly emphasized that the war started with Crimea and will end with Crimea. Ukraine's achievements on the peninsula to date are too great to ignore. From military installations to air defense systems, from naval capabilities to strategic points, Russia has felt the impact of the Ukrainian offensive in every area. The Black Sea Fleet was forced to retreat to safer harbors, and the Russian population in Crimea began to leave the peninsula. But Donald Trump's approach to Crimea risks overshadowing all these Ukrainian efforts. It remains to be seen how Trump's policy will affect Ukraine's struggle. Will Crimea really be Ukraine's crowning glory, or will diplomatic games change the course of the war? The coming period will witness critical developments that will determine the fate of Crimea. Thank you for following us.